Thanks, Catherine, and tēnā koutou, katoa, everybody. It's wonderful to see such a large number of people here, and I think it's a real testament to the place that Cantabrians hold freshwater, that there's so many of you here. We put a deliberately provocative title for the talk tonight, but it really does indicate what we've been trying to work on. We've been trying to find solutions rather than identify problems. There's a lot of problem identification to be able to solve problems, but we really think the true test of ecologists' mettle and our value in the world is if we can solve problems, and so that's very much where our efforts and this project has been directed. And we've managed to work with a large number of people in that, and as Catherine said, we're really grateful for that. If you were to start something like this, you have to figure out where to start, and we spent a reasonable amount of time doing that. Perhaps a little frustration trying to figure out how you might approach something like this, but it was worth it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I'm going to talk about then three main problems which we've been tackling, which are fine sediment, weedy plants, and nutrients, and then wrap up with a few take-home messages. Well, we really should start in riparian zones if we were going to solve lots of Canterbury's water problems, and they're really important for a number of reasons. And this diagram pretty much illustrates those. They provide buffers and intercept contaminants. They're particularly important for preventing sediment, fine sediment, which I'm going to talk about a lot, from getting into waterways. They also provide shade, which is important for a number of reasons, so I'm going to talk about tonight. These plants also provide organic matter, which is food for many of the organisms which live in these waterways. So overall, riparian zones are really where we really ought to start this problem, solving these problems. And this is something that we did. It's only just been published, and actually, all of the things that have been published that I'll refer to tonight, if you want to look at them, the references are here, short references, if you want them. This is a study that a master's student did, Karen, and it pretty much describes riparian zones over a large number of sites spread over a number of stream sizes in Canterbury. And you can see that there's 66% of those sites, according to us, are less than 5 metres, and actually only 6% are greater than 25 metres. Quite often when North Island ecologists come down here, they preach the mantra that we ought to have really large riparian zones, that 25 metres is what we ought to be aiming for. One of the problems is that that's going to be very difficult to achieve given current land use situation in Canterbury, and so being realistic about what we can manage and what might be achievable, particularly in the short term, in this is going to be really important. And so we need to be working with a lot of this to start off with, and yeah, we might be aiming here. I'm going to be talking about some of this later on, but this is particularly where we're at the moment. We started off doing a widespread survey to look at sites across Canterbury. We were particularly interested in the effectiveness of that riparian management that we had in the place at the moment. Cornerstones of that are things like fencing, riparian buffers, some vegetation in that riparian zone. So we surveyed things like stock access, shade, buffer intactness, width, soil drainage, adjacent land cover, and those sorts of things. We used this protocol from Harding et al. In 2009, and we produced a riparian management index. I'm not going to talk too much more about that. It's a means to an end to kind of surveying these sorts of things. This is the range of kinds of habitats that we were looking at. In the end, we were using invertebrate communities. So this is, what is this? Yes, mayfly, good, yes, Dilithidium. And so this is one of the most common stream insects in New Zealand. They're particularly sensitive to contaminants and those sorts of things. And actually we think that using stream insects is a very good way of measuring stream health because they're sampling the environment over time. So they give you a measure of what's happening over time. We've used the combination of mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies, as some of you will be sitting there smugly knowing what the EPT part of that means. If you don't, it's the homework for tonight to go and figure out what that means once you get home. But it's to do with the scientific names for mayflies, stoneflies and caddisflies. And so we call that index percent EPT. So it's basically the proportion of the community that's made up of these types of stream insects, which are the most sensitive ones. So it's kind of a measure of the presence of those sensitive taxa insects in the streams. And if we look at this, you can see we're comparing the percent EPT here, and communities which aren't very healthy would have lots of snails and worms and those sorts of things in them. Those that are healthy would have lots of these insects in them. These are particularly low percentages anyway. And you can see that this is not very impressive, right? There's not a very big difference between things which we categorised, splitting those in half, between unmanaged and managed. That's not how we want it to be. And it's pretty much indicative of how those riparian zones are functioning in Canterbury at the moment, we think, and it's a situation that we need to change if we're to solve problems. On the other hand, if you have a look at those 88 streams across lowland Canterbury on a gradient of size, so that's discharge, so the amount of water going down per metre cubed per second, in terms of size, then there's a very big difference between things which are large and things which are small. So small streams, small waterways, running water, and by far and away the much worse off of those waterways. They're not in really great condition at all. That's a pattern which we found ubiquitously across Canterbury in these lowland areas that we've been working. And if you put this together to try and understand the relationships between variables, you can do something like this. Now, it's called a structural equation model, but don't get put off by that. Just look at the arrows here. They pretty much illustrate what we think are the links between these kind of components and the fauna, the health, which we're measuring through this percent EPT. The main drivers here are waterway size, in that bigger things are in better condition than small things. That's particularly influential on in-stream habitat, and that's particularly driven by the amount of sediment. And I'm going to be talking about sediment a lot. And that is particularly influential on these invertebrates. There's some direct effects of size, but it's mostly driven by the quality of the habitat. And so small waterways are in much worse condition than larger ones. The riparian management has an effect on the food resources, the kind of leaves and organic matter and that kind of stuff that's in there, but it doesn't extend to the invertebrates, and there's relatively little effect of the riparian management that we have in place at the moment that we can detect. That's not great. This is the kind of situation which we've been working to try and improve. The question is, where do you start again to try and do that? And, we think the obvious place is at the top. You need to start at the top because those smaller waterways are the ones that are in the worst condition, but they're also the ones that we have the most potential to change, because they're small, they're at the top of the drainage network, they're easier to work with. They're also the most common in Canterbury. This is kind of a back of the envelope calculation of waterway length. Notice I'm not saying stream length, waterway length. These are waterways which are connected in the stream network, and that they flow out to something which is connected to the sea. Water races go from being bigger to getting smaller because we take water out of them. These are things which go from being small to getting bigger. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you can see that there's about 8,000 kilometres of them just in this local part of Canterbury here, which are small. They're smaller than the step over with the red bands kind of size that we might be thinking about in some of the riparian management accords and those sorts of things which we've entered into. They're small, and they're a problem. Many of them are human constructs. They're not natural waterways that were there originally. They're parts of a drainage network which we've dug to make it possible to farm the plains, because the plains were mostly wetland and those sorts of things. And so these have been created. Lots of them are drainage ditches and drains. But they're connected to to the larger drainage network. So regardless of how we define them legally, they're still something which we're trying to work on. And so we think at the moment we've got pretty sparse riparian management, which is spread mostly through the downstream parts of catchments. We really need to focus on these upstream bits, which are where most of the problems are. So measures number one is very much start at the top. That's where we've started with Carex. That's the Canterbury waterway rehabilitation experiment, which we've been working on for about the last 2.5 years. We've got 5 years of funding. We're about halfway through or a little over that. The project at the moment involves 23 landowners, 9 kilometres of waterways across 14 farms. We're testing a whole range of tools which we might be able to implement to try and solve some of the problems in those waterways. There's lots of people involved, but pretty much one experiment. And we've specifically tried to get as far upstream as we can, so we're working most of these waterways are actually start at springheads, so the water's coming out of the ground there. If we haven't been able to start at the top, we've been trying to figure out ways of isolating those reaches. Pretty much we're trying to generate robust science at the same time as implementing these restoration solutions and trying to communicate that to people involved on the ground in waterway management. These are just some of the team, fantastic group of people who've really worked their butts off to pull this off. It's involved lots of negotiation with all sorts of people and bringing people along with us. And I really think that's the approach, that's the underpinning of the approach. And I haven't got that as one of the conclusions on here today, but I really want to stress that actually working with people to figure out what's feasible, what's viable, what might work has been really useful. And there are lots of things which we've gleaned from talking to farmers, which have helped us implement things and come up with things that we might not have thought of and eliminate things which are just plain stupid. Because we're sitting in an ivory tower and they're not. The work's been funded by the Mackenzie Charitable Foundation and the University of Canterbury, but these organisations have funded various bits of the in-stream work. I should say that the Mackenzie Charitable Foundation trustees were very keen for us to be independent and non-aligned, and that's the way that we've maintained. We maintained it. We're doing what we think is the best thing, working in the way that we want to, and these organisations are supporting our project in terms of providing resources for things that we've decided to do. But this is very much what we of the Carex team think and the world according to us tonight. I want to mention, the farmers again. This is actually an aerial picture of Richard and Jill Simpson's property. I don't think they'll mind me mentioning this at Silverstream, which is in the Tiwai catchment. They've been in the news a little bit, if you might have heard a Country Life program where they were interviewed a few weeks ago. We were amazed when we went there. This is by far and away one of the best sites on the plains that we found. This is a small Kiwi2 covenant, which they made quite a few years ago, fenced off, started planting way before we even came on the scene. And this is what it looks like today. We've transformed some things down here, but the spring head is in here. This is what I mean by starting at the top. They started that quite a few years ago, way before we were on the scene, as I said. And we've been working with them quite a lot, and I'm going to show you some pictures of this reach down here later in the talk. These are all the sites. They're sort of colour-coded by the district council that they're associated with. There's a bunch down here in Hinds, some up near the Ashburton Forks, some near Rangiora, and some in the Tiwai catchment here. So those are the 9 where the 9 1 kilometre reaches are. As I said, the main problems which we've been focusing on are nutrients, fine sediment, and aquatic weeds. Probably nutrients might be pretty obvious to you as why we think that's a problem. I'm about to explain why we think sediment is probably the number one problem, and also why aquatic weeds are just a plain pain in the ass. But before I do that, I should say that we're working at 3 main scales. The first scale is this kind of stream scale where we've got 9 waterways and they're 1 kilometre long. We've also been working with reaches because you have to kind of split things up into aliquots which are easily sampleable, and so that's the deal with the reaches. And there's quadrats or server samples or some unit which we sampled inside them. But we've also been looking at things which we're calling hotspots. Traditionally, you might miss these in some sort of biomonitoring approach, but they're quite often associated with little drains, rills, features of the waterways which are associated with accumulations of contaminants. And when you go and walk the waterways, they're quite often pretty easy to find. Sometimes they're hidden, like they're tile drains, and you have to go and move out and find things, but they're obvious to us because you can see plumes of sediment coming out of them and things like that. They're going to be particularly important. We particularly think that a failure to account for multiple stresses, and so the stresses that we're working on here are sediment, nutrients, and those aquatic weeds, as I said. The failure to account for multiple stresses and dealing with the scales that they operate at is probably a main reason why a lot of our riparian management isn't working so far, or is a main cause of disappointment in how effective that is. So we're aiming to really overcome those. The scientific history of restoration, particularly in streams, is littered with problems and issues and failures and disappointments. And so we really need to move on from that, and that's where our science is aimed particularly. Let me just entertain you perhaps for a wee minute with some hypothetical scientist diagrams. I'm not going to do too much of this, but I want you to get your mind around this because it's going to be important at the end. There's one piece of jargon I'm going to tell you about, hysteresis. It's basically when you apply some restoration tool, and so I'm showing time here, and then we're kicking the system with some tools where we're trying to change some things and move it from the state that it's in at the moment to some other sort of state. If you do those sorts of things and you don't get any change, very often it's because the system's in a state of hysteresis where there's something that's preventing it from changing to another state that you would like it to be in. Tiwai Hora is an example of a system which is going to be very difficult to move from the state that it's in at the moment. But we know that it has been in a different state at some point in the past. You can apply multiple tools very often and you don't get the result that you want. Maybe, and what we're hypothesising and expecting here is that if you can get the scales at which you're applying those right and the combinations, then you might start to get some sort of recovery. And so that's where we're going at, and that's what I hope I'm going to be able to come back, and you'll all come back in 2 or 3 years, and we can go over the final results of this. Pretty much what I'm showing you tonight is an interim update, and I'm going to show you about what we've been doing so far. So sediment, this is it. It's out there. There's a lot of it. It's a problem. It's a problem because, and here's an indication of in what sort of sense it's a problem. Here, this is a gradient. This is some great work which Francis Burden did as part of his PhD early on in the first phase of the project. This is a cover of fine sediment. So we're talking about particles less than 1 millimetre here. And this is percent EPT that we were looking at before. Pretty much all of the sort of biological variables I'm going to show you are going to be this percent EPT. And there's this threshold relationship. We're around about 20%. Once you get more than 20% fine sediment cover on the bed, you lose a lot of those sensitive invertebrates. So there's a decline. It might be called a tipping point, although there's some scientific debate about whether that term's appropriate. But there's definitely a threshold. We think that this ought to be part of our national framework for bottom lines. We think it's really important. We think that lots of the data nationally are now stacking up with this around this 20% number. We'll see how that goes, but certainly it's something which we're attacking with gusto. It's been called fine sediment's been called a master stressor because it's so influential. This is why. If you put a whole lot of fine stuff and fill up all of those holes between the cracks in the rocks, interstices, you're taking away lots of the habitat and lots of the space that those bugs, those invertebrates will live in. So it's really important, and lots of the fencing regulations and those sorts of things are really designed to deal with this sediment problem. So if you've got this, the invertebrates can't move through, there's no refuge here, the fish eventually run out of prey, and it's a major cause of impairment. I think there's very little doubt about that. If you start to look at our sites, and here I'm showing 6 of them here, just indicated by letter codes, and you think about those scales that I was talking about before, stream scale in the green and the reach scale in the purple, and you look across these streams, these box and whisker plots sort of pretty much show the range of sediment cover that we're seeing. You can see that all apart from this one down here, YM, way above the 20% level. In fact, I've been trying very hard not to say BO because that doesn't have very good connotations, but I've said it so I can get it over and done with. So up here, all of these sites, but the thing I want you to notice is that there's a lot of variability here. And actually, when we do some analysis of the scale at which the variability lies, most of it is between reaches. So you can go into one reach here and it can have relatively little sediment in it, and you can go into another reach and you have lots and lots of fine sediment in it. And most of 60% of the variability is between those reaches. Apart from this, maybe this site here, which is pretty much ubiquitously sedimented, there's a lot of scope here for dealing with this problem on a smaller scale, and that's definitely fixable. If we think about what might cause those problems, they're things like this. These are some extreme situations. What we call leaky plumbing. They're things where there are fences in place, but there are drains and rills and things like this, where there's obviously a source of sediment which is basically going through the fence. This is, a bizarre extreme situation, but things like tile drains, which pretty much go through and circumvent that protection network that we've set out, that fencing and that planting, go past the protection network. So they're a problem, they're a place where these contaminants can get through. So we've been trying in a prerequisite for working with the 9 sets of landowners was that that they were keen to be involved, they wanted us there, and that they had at least the most basic protection networks for their waterways in place. So all of them have that in place. We've been working to make them better. Here's an example. This is a hawthorn hedge. It's not providing great shade. Under here, there's some very oversteepened banks, a lot of bank collapse which you can't see. This waterway has to be cleared out mechanically lots because there are lots of weeds in it. More about that soon. So we sought to deal with the bank problem, the angle of the bank, which is a major source of that sediment. So, we did some pretty major earthworks to start off with. That involves exposing some soil and some sediment. There's been some planting going on here. That's where all the money from those organisations supporting us have gone. So there's a lot of bank rebattering. This is the kinds of slopes that we need to prevent that sedimentation. The farmer has moved this fence back on this side. This is the side that we need to provide, and you can see there's a lot more planting on this side than the other side, and the shadows indicate where the sun's coming from nicely here. So we're trying to shade the waterway with more planting on this side than the other side. This is what it pretty much looks like now. It's part of the Dr. Fonterra Living Water program, and we've got some problems with the wet wool. We've got some problems with some weeds going on here, but we're getting much more of the bank cover, and we've eliminated a lot of those hot spots that we had before. If you have a look at the effects of the hot spots in this sort of spatial scale analysis before, it's pretty stunning actually. These are the same 6 sites, but this time with the hot spots included. So have a look at that. This site here, which was looking pretty great before, they were probably feeling pretty smug about the condition of their waterway in comparison to the rest. Actually, there are some not great parts in there. And so there are hotspots in lots of places. And when you look at, you include the hotspots in this analysis, lots of those problems are at the reach scale. And one of the biggest challenges is that that sediment is already in the waterway. So unless there's some mechanism which is going to get it out, and I've already said lots of these waterways are springs, right? Do springs flood very much? No, so there's not a lot of flow variability to move that on, and so it's a challenge. And so we've been thinking about ways of getting that out. I just want to show you some data from the tile drains just to convince you about that. These are tile drains are a source of sediment, and we're hoping this data illustrates that. So the main drains are in blue. Tile drains are in red, open drains are in green, the sites are all along this axis here, and turbidity. We ask students all this all the time. Turbidity is measured in NTUs, which is really nasty. They're like nephritic turbidity units. Is that right, John? Yeah, good. So there'll be an exam later, but basically that's the units that we measure turbidity, and you can see that many of these are really high. They're high against any of the sort of standards we want to apply. A lot of those are coming from tile drains. So there's sediment coming out of tile drains, which is going in there. What we've done when we've put in all these tile drains, and quite often, I can see the logic there that this waterway, this open channel, is a problem. We need to get it to drain. We cover it over. It's not so much of a problem anymore. We can carry on doing things. But we've taken out that natural filtering kind of network. We've put a lot of it underground. And now we've got, we've just got tile drains flowing into other waterways, and that's a challenge to deal with. So, second point here I want you to go home with is we really need to have complete riparian protection systems in place. That will involve eliminating slumps, rills, bank collapse, and managing intermittent channels, things like tile drains and open drains, which circumvent the network, circumvent that protection network. Some things that we can do, and we've been trialling, that we have in place already to deal with the sediment which is in there, sediment traps. These are effectively large pools. This one's about 12 metres long. It's about 0.7 of a metre deep, so about this deep. And the idea here is to get the water slowing down enough, down to about this amount, where we can get these really fine particles dropping out of suspension. So we need to get the water to slow so the particles will drop. Interestingly enough, whenever we've dug these, we've almost always found trout in them almost immediately, like within a couple of hours. They know where it's good to go. And our measurements so far suggest that these can collect something around 70% of the sediment flux. So the amount of sediment moving downstream per unit time, we're collecting about 70% of that. This is what one of these looks like. You can see the sediment coming in here. You can see the edge of it when it's dug here, and there's some gravel here. And it's, it's filling up. We use carpet tiles stuck to paving stones like this to accumulate the sediment, to measure that. And there's lots of it in there. Pine cones sit there as well, but that's just an aside. We've tried a sand one or a stream vacuum cleaner. You're laughing. I thought they were laughing because this is John. This is two professors on the end of a piece of machinery. And I actually ripped my waders after 5 minutes. But this is a stream vacuum cleaner, which is basically a large piece of equipment which kind of shoots out water, and at the same time it sucks things up. And we've trialled it, and it has this effect more or less. This is the stream before vacuuming. This is what it looks after vacuuming, so we can remove sediment. It's pretty effective, but it takes a long time. And John and I probably lasted half an hour probably, and then some younger, more fit people needed to take over. But the point is that removing sediment does make a pretty measurable difference. You can see it, but here's just a small amount of data to show you how, and this is within the first week or so after doing a manipulation like this. It's in a different place. This is a control which has lots of sediment in it still. You can see percent EPT is really low. If you narrow the channel a bit so you get some water flow over the top, you get an increase. If you do this kind of flushing, you get an increase, but if you do both, then you get lots more increase. So the invertebrates respond very quickly, and we get recovery. Sediment's really, really important to get rid of. Number one stressor. And it's really unlikely that, we think it's unlikely that we're going to get recovery unless we can get in-stream fine sediment cover less than 20%. And lots of that will involve removing the legacy that's already there. It's not, it's not from some, the last, 10 years of intensification or something like that. It's 150 years of agriculture on the plains. We're talking about a large legacy. It's not something that someone's done in the last 10 years. Aquatic weeds. They look pretty, but I said they're annoying. The two main culprits are monkey musk and watercress. They pretty much clog up channels like this. When we started out, we thought they might be part of the solution. Why did we think they were part of the solution? Well, some people thought that they might be useful for taking up nutrients. Some plants, aquatic plants, things like raupo, taifa, are really good at doing nutrient uptake, but they have quite different structures to these sorts of plants. Like raupo has a hollow stem. They can do things like denitrification, help with that. Our work really suggests that these plants are not going to help in Canterbury. The macrophytes are pretty much saturated with nitrate. Oh, so the plants are called macrophytes. Big plants, live in water, call them macrophytes. Sorry, jargon. Promised I wasn't going to talk about that, but I got macrophytes all through here, so you're just going to have to deal with it, okay? They're saturated with nitrate. They take up barely a measurable amount. If we've done an experiment where we pull them all out of a reach and compare the amount of nutrient going through before and after, we can't measure a difference. And if you look at it like this, it's kind of shocking, but it'll help. Peak standing stocks, say in a 150 metre reach, are around 20 kilograms of nitrate associated with those macrophytes and about 2 kilograms of phosphorus. The daily flux of nitrate through, and these are moderate nitrate level streams, is about 10 kilograms per day and about 15 grams of soluble reactive phosphorus. So taking all the macrophytes out would account for about 2 days worth of the nitrogen and about 130 days worth of the phosphorus. So, it's not really going to get us very far, taking those out. Moreover, we think the phosphorus uptake is dominated by algae. We've measured that. We think that they're by far and away much more important than macrophytes. And having all of those big plants growing there is shading out and crowding out the algae, which actually might do some good for us, because they're probably much more effective at taking out those nutrients. And so we want them to be working. We need the algae and other microorganisms to be doing the job of nutrient uptake for us. They're also a problem, and we absolutely agree with the farmers on this, that they're a problem because of drainage. They spend lots of money in their rates and other things. Some of them are private drains, digging them out because they clog the waterways up. You get sediment deposition, you get a lot of this drainage function, and you have to do things like this, which is mechanical clearance. Almost all of the waterways we're working in have some sort of mechanical clearance going on in them at some point in time because they have problems with these plants. That can result in the over-steepened banks. If you're always digging them out, it gets U-shaped, really steep. You have a sediment problem, you can get habitat loss, you can get fauna entrained. You kind of reset succession, so you're basically constantly moving the stream back to some bare state, and you can get fragments released downstream. So we've been trying really hard to figure out ways of dealing with these plants. This Katie Collins, who's here, this is the subject of her PhD. If she doesn't solve the problem, she's not going to get a PhD. No pressure, Katie. No, I'm not serious. Interestingly, if you have a look at this, this is a weed mat treatment, and we think that solving some of their ability to be able to root on the bank might prevent them from clogging. This is something that involves weed killer, so weed control. This is something that involves shading, and something I've already learned is that if you provide partial shade, it just provides a lovely little microclimate for them to grow, and it becomes worse. However, full shade does work. It's really effective, and this is what it looks like if you can provide full shade. So full shade is definitely an answer, but how practical is this in a Canterbury situation? Are we going to have shade cloth tunnels all across the Canterbury Plains? Probably not, but it's a proof of concept kind of thing. And what we're really interested in at the moment is how much shade is enough to kind of get the suppression that we want. That's what this experiment is about, which is running at the moment. It's still going. We're hoping that we're going to find something about where it is it 80%, 60% that we're aiming for? But it's obviously only a short-term solution. The macrophyte plants, the weedy invasive plants which are submergent and live mostly under the water, are extra problems. And what we've tried, and I actually thought John Harding was pretty crazy when he suggested this, it's his idea, but it's worked out brilliantly, was that we've covered whole reaches with black polythene. And again, you're probably thinking, well, that's not very practical in a Canterbury sense. We're not going to cover lots of reaches with black polythene. But underneath that black polythene at the moment, all the plants are dead. There's nice, clean gravel. If we roll it back, we might get 3, 4 growing seasons before we have to do some other sort of control. So we think that that could be a way of starting from a place where we have relatively few plants. So we're trying to run with that and see if we can make it work. We've also got some large-scale kind of controls going on. You might have seen this if you live near Rangiora. This is what it looks like. This is what it looked like in autumn this year, sort of uncontrolled. This is a large-scale bank weed mat treatment where we've been trying to experiment with if we can stop the macrophytes from growing and rooting in the bank. And we think that that's looking pretty successful at the moment. You might be able to even go and check it out. This is the long-term fix though. If we can get something that irrigators can go over the top of, which can provide the level of shade which we need. The Carex are what? What sort of plants are they? Yeah, cutty grass, something like that. There's a few botanists in the audience, I'm not looking at Dave Kelly's direction. The cutty grass, right? Maybe even the leaves moving might even cut off the plants to stop them from growing. So if we can move to something like this, we think there's a lot of chance that we can improve that. And this is one of the sites that we're working on in Hinds at the moment. So we need to find the shade sweet spot and implement some long-term control techniques. Nutrients. They're probably the most difficult. They're the most difficult because of the scale which we think they're working at. And I'm going to show you one of these scale analyses to start off with here again. Most variation in nitrate is between waterways. If you have a look at this, there's very little of the variation is between reaches. And that's really indicative of the fact that the nitrate inputs are controlled at a catchment level. Lots of the inputs to these waterways are spring, lots of it's coming from groundwater. It means the inputs are remote, in many cases are remote from the sites that we're working at. That makes it pretty difficult for us as stream ecologists, who are pretty much working at the end of the pipe, if you think about it, to deal with those problems. But we really do need to deal with them. You can see that some of these are very high, and North American colleagues were pretty astounded by this when we presented some of this most recently in North America. We've got lots of things going on here, but it's really going to involve the process which is going on through the Canterbury Water Management Strategy in your communities at the moment. So I think, please take advantage of all the Carex communications that are going on. If you're not on our mailing list, then get on it, please. But most of all, get involved in your communities, because we need to negotiate the processes around catchment nutrient levels, because that's the scale at which the nutrient problem is controlled. Having said that, and that's where we need to put a lot of energy, we've also been trying to work at a local scale. And if you start to include those hotspots, which are like this, and do that analysis again, then you start to see some outliers and some really high numbers, like 20 milligrams per litre of nitrate is high anywhere around the world. I think I saw one value of 25 milligrams from Iowa, or was it Illinois, one of the two, when I was in a North American conference recently, but they're astoundingly high. You explain more variation, but these suggest that there are local hotspots of nutrient pollution. A lot of those are associated with tile drains. Again, we can measure them. Their ability to be able to log continuously nitrate inputs is a challenge. It's very difficult to measure. The technology's a challenge. We can take grab samples, but that's pretty lab intensive as well. Here's a kind of a cartoon of one of our reaches. And what I'm illustrating here are the flows, the flow inputs. So it gains about a third of the flow going from 0 to 1,000 metres. There are a number of tile drains coming in here. Most of their flows are modest. There's one on this side, which is pretty large. It's a major input. It's probably accounting for lots of this increase in flow at the bottom compared to the top. If you superimpose the nitrate daily flux on that in kilograms, so 31 kilograms per day coming in, 53 per day going out. Yeah, it's pretty horrific in a way, but we're trying to, we need to be able to deal with this. Then there's 22 associated with this input, but it's in proportion to the flow that's coming in. There's one over here which is disproportionately high, and that's because there's a local source coming out of that trial drain which is higher concentration than the rest of the waterway. So that is something that we can target locally and we can work on. And so we're working to try and fix that. That's Brandon Gola's PhD goal mostly. This is the sort of thing that Brandon's been doing. He's got to play with bulldozers and all that sort of thing. I don't think they've ever let you drive any yet so far, Brandon. But we've been building bioreactors. Bioreactors are basically, in our case, are big holes in the ground where we put in lots of carbon. The carbon's in the form of these wood chips. And so this is in the middle of a tile drain just before it goes into one of our waterways. And the idea here is that the carbon acts as a substrate for microbes to grow, and that those microbes, if we can get lots of microbial growth, will do the job of denitrification for us, so turning nitrate into nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. And we know from work overseas and elsewhere that this can be very effective if you can get it working right at removing relatively large amounts of nitrate from waterways. And we think that those sorts of solutions are some of the best options for our tile drain type situations at the moment. It's still very early days. These all went in the summer. We've got some which are edge of field bioreactors. We've got one which is associated with a tile drain, and we're trying a number of different configurations of those. Watch this space to see if they're working. Oh, okay, slipped off the bottom here, but Brandon's also produced a sort of summary paper about bioreactors this summer. Another thing that we've been trying to do is do ecosystem scale organic matter additions. So this is basically stuffing, literally, lots of leaves into, in this case we put them into mesh bags because we wanted them to stay there, and putting them into streams. We put 200, 350 gram leaf packs per 200 metre reach, so a lot of organic matter. That's about the amount of organic matter that you would expect if you had a full canopy there and they were dropping all the leaves. And we know that we can get pretty good increases in denitrification. The units are difficult to get your mind around here, but look at the bars in the leaf pack and the three treatment streams compared to the control streams. We're increasing the amount of denitrification. We've started modelling that, and we've started modelling it in the Can catchment, which is where most of these drains are that we're working on. Here's a flux model for that whole system. The size of the circles pretty much represent the amount of nitrate going downstream per unit time, so it's a grams per second kind of measure. There's a lot of variability across the catchment. Some places are gaining nitrate, some places are losing it. What we want to do is enhance that loss through denitrification. And this is the relationship which we've got from this model. We're just preparing this to be submitted hopefully in the next month or so. If we could get, say, a canopy of greater than 80% along most of that waterway. Now, I understand we're a long way away from that. We might get something more like 30% of the nitrate lost through denitrification, scaling up these measurements here to a whole catchment scale. So that's the kind of effect that we could have working in stream if we can scale it up to a catchment level. That might be a best case scenario. So, and that's, there's some assumptions around that. We think one of the best options, but also one of the most challenging to implement, is something called a two-stage channel. It looks like this. If you have a look at this, this is one that we've built in an intermittent channel in one of the Carex streams, and we've built a floodplain. Pretty much the main channel goes along the middle there, and there's a floodplain. And the way it would work is when you get an increase in flow coming down, the water would go out onto the floodplain, it sits there, there's lots of organic matter, you would get sediment deposition, and we know from, again, work in North America that you can get substantial amounts of nitrogen retention, where it's retained on the banks, taken up by the plants, or denitrified in that riparian zone in the floodplain. We know that that can work. There's some challenges about the water levels. We need to get, it's not going to work in springs, for example, because they don't flood. So we need things that might flood up onto these floodplains to be able to make that work. So we're trying to find particular situations for that. This is the best we've been able to do in this iteration of our work. We really would like to do a couple more of these, but it's not going to, well, it's for the future mostly. And we're hoping we can get some data out of this one in the interim to really prove that this can be worthwhile and is feasible to make in Canterbury. The thing that it's going to require is a lot more land, right? Yeah, because this is a decent amount of land that this farmer's committed to this channel at the moment. So end-of-pipe solutions can offset some of the nutrient problems. That's a take-home message, and I think that we need to be working on these solutions in the interim while the catchment level ones kick in. So really the take-home messages here are: start at the top, fix the leaky plumbing. We need to deal with all of those things which are escaping our protection network, remove the sediment legacies, shade out the macrophytes to allow the rest of the stream ecology to kind of do its work, negotiate on-land nutrient inputs at the catchment level to try and get some better outcomes there, and implement these end-of-pipe solutions in the interim. Thanks very much for listening. I think the message here is if you can implement these combinations of strategies, if we can get the strategies right, we might get faster recovery. That's what we're really after. We're after the optimum combination of strategies at the right scale so we can get the fastest recovery. And it's going to involve quite a bit more work. But I really do want to thank all of these people, particularly the hard-working students who really made this possible, and the farmers who've worked with us. Thank you.